All right, guys, so today we're talking about chapter 6, another one of my favorite chapters. And we're just looking at the one of the first global civilizations. And that's the Roman Republic, which became the Roman Empire. And then toward the end, we'll spend a little time comparing the Roman Empire to the Han Dynasty in China. It's just amazing how similar the two are. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that if time allows toward the end. So first I just wanted to look at where we're talking about on the map. So if you zoom out, you've got the Mediterranean Sea, Greek for Middle Earth, and then if you were looking at the Italian peninsula on a map, it's as close to the center of the Mediterranean as you can get. It's ideally located for trade, for colonization, strategically. They have plentiful access to the sea, plentiful waterways within. It is just an ideal place to establish a large and prominent civilization. Now, the image on your right is the city of Rome itself. And so you may, if you read any literature surrounding the Roman Empire, they'll talk about the 7 hills surrounding the Tiber. And Rome was built around these 7 hills that served as kind of a natural strategic defense. And then the Tiber River there is of an incredible significance. So I'll mention that when we get into Julius Caesar, and crossing the Tiber into the city of Rome was a big deal. So anyway. So I want to zoom out for a sec. So you can see here how Italy is centered, close to Greece, and so the two actually develop a very similar culture, though speak different languages. In fact, you can really call this the Greco-Roman world because both cultures have a significant influence on the Mediterranean, and then the Romans even further, colonizing Great Britain, as far north into what they then called Germania, or we would call now the nation of Germany, and as far east as Anatolia, and even further east really will become the eventual Byzantine Empire. What in the highlight or the high points of the Roman Empire was simply called the eastern part of the Roman Empire. So anyway, kind of a pretty big deal. So we'll start with early Rome. And, unlike Greece, Italy has an abundance of arable or agricultural land. And it's built around these 7 hills and right along the Tiber River, as we saw on the map earlier. Like you saw, the Italian peninsula is surrounded on 3 sides by the Mediterranean Sea. Plentiful ports, plentiful access to trade and other peoples and cultures. And so it's just a natural place to have a very influential and wealthy civilization. So the earliest peoples there were a group called the Etruscans, and they established a kingdom. They built some of the earliest roads, some of the earliest places of worship and businesses and shops. They were eventually overthrown, though, in 509 BCE. Oh, and I did want to mention before I moved on, the name Rome comes from this first emperor, Romulus, and his brother Remus. So according to Roman legend, the two were raised by wolves. There's quite a bit of mythology and significance surrounding them. And then ironically, the very last emperor of the Roman Empire would also be named Romulus. So I don't know if they saw the writing on the wall and then named their kid this kind of ominous, significant title. But anyway, just so happened the last emperor was named Romulus. Okay, so this is not how the forum actually looks today. In fact, most of it is in ruins. But at the highlight of the Roman Republic, this is what the Roman Forum perhaps would have looked like. And the word forum really just means a place to talk. And where this was so significant is, like the Greeks, while they would elect representatives, to make decisions on their behalf, the citizens of Rome could come to the forum and openly express grievances, and many of the very rights that we think of as our basic civil rights were established as part of Roman law. Now the Romans, when the Etruscan kings were overthrown, they were replaced by a people group moving in from the north called the Latins. They just called that because they spoke the language of Latin. But they also established the city-states of Latium, and they were eventually defeated by the Romans. But also, really, Italy is a hodgepodge of different cultures. I mean, it's not like the Etruscans disappeared. The Latins didn't disappear. The Romans moved in, but also there were Greeks. And so from its very beginning, Rome was a very multicultural place. And that, I think, is a real strength that we're going to see as they begin to grow and begin to colonize and conquer. They have this adaptability to absorb people of different languages and cultures and religions into the concept of Rome. And so that really creates this confederation or alliance of so many different people. Now, Rome will eventually become a state, and over time, the entire Italian peninsula will be a unified political entity called the Roman state. But even in the early days, there was a real struggle of classes between the wealthy and the poor. The wealthy called patricians. Sometimes you'll still hear that word used to describe a very wealthy class of people. And then common folk were called plebeians. And this would have been the majority of the Roman people. And so, if you ever hear the concept of the 1 or the 2% versus the 98%, this is patricians versus plebeians, and this old class struggle, as you can see, is very ancient. But now, the two classes, plebeians and patricians, are going to wind up becoming two different legislative bodies. There's the assembly of the plebeians, and then what will become the Senate representing the patricians. And so, while it's not an exact comparison, it is similar to our bicameral legislature, where we have the Senate, which we adopted the British model, which goes all the way back to the Roman model. The British call it the House of Lords, and that means representatives of not the people, but the places and the powerful within. And then you have the House of Commons in Great Britain. We call it the House of Representatives, which is similar to the Assembly of Plebeians, or the representatives of the rest of us. Now, Rome's story of conquest, I've just always been fascinated about. Maybe it's the legions, maybe it's the stories. I just grew up hearing about this. The story of Christianity is so tied up in Roman history, so maybe that's something that always fascinated me since I've just been into religious history. But a few things to just note from this map. If you look at the coast of North Africa here, that's the city-state of Carthage. And in Rome's early history, that's going to be one of their major rivals. Not their only one, but that's where we'll start with the Punic Wars. Now, speaking of the Punic Wars, the first Punic War began in 264 BCE. And Rome was beginning its process of growth. Carthage wound up surrendering the island of Sicily, which became a Roman province, and that war had subsided by about 241 BCE. So you can see already in the First Punic War alone, decades of conflict. And so by the time we get to the Third Punic War, these folks have been at war off and on for over 100 years. And so it's not, conflict in it's almost like a Cold War. Like it heats up at different points in their history. But the most famous of these that you may be familiar with is the Second Punic War. And this is the one where, if you've ever heard of Hannibal and his famous army of war elephants, he took an army of elephants. Now, I say army, there were about 42. But he had a massive army, much larger than anything that Rome had. And then he did have these war elephants. So even though there aren't many of them, just the image of that is so famous. Because really what he did with this army was unprecedented for the time. To land at any of these Italian ports would have been disastrous. They were all well defended. Establishing a beachhead would have just been costly. And so instead, he landed to the north of Italy and marched his army over the Alps. Now, this also proved costly, and it's always questionable which would have been the better decision. But for better or worse, he did it. Many of his elephants died crossing the Alps. Many of his men died crossing the Alps. But he still arrived in the Italian peninsula with an incredibly unstoppable force. And the Romans knew this. They knew that to face Carthage and Hannibal's armies in open battle, they'd be destroyed. And so instead, and I can't say they invented this tactic, but this is where the French word guerrilla, or to subvert, comes from. Is from the Roman general Scipio, who quickly realized that to face Hannibal in open combat would just be disastrous. And so instead, they began a campaign of ambushing, hit and run, destroying supply lines, picking at Hannibal's army. And so even though Hannibal never lost an open battle, and the Romans really never fully faced the army in the field, eventually Hannibal was forced to withdraw, and he returned to Carthage. And this was the end of the Second Punic War. Now, in the Third Punic War, and again, this has gone on for over 100 years by the time this is over, so there's this just bitter legacy of hatred between these two peoples. Carthage was completely destroyed. And it was said that the Romans sowed salt into the fields, destroyed the cities, and dispersed the people. They wanted Carthage to be no more forever. And what was left became a province of the Roman Empire.
Just out of curiosity, did the Romans really need to hate Carthage, or were they just that kind of people? They like to crucify people by the dozens?
Yeah, now the greatest, I don't want to say greatest, the largest act of mass crucifixion was actually done by the Romans in response to a slave uprising. So if you ever hear or read, and I'll tell you a little about Spartacus, but it was a famous slave uprising that threatened the Roman Empire at their height. Roughly 100,000 slaves, and all of the Roman legions had to be recalled to stop it. And the Romans did defeat Spartacus and the uprising. And in response, they crucified every one of them along a road between Rome and Naples. So I'm not going to say they were that cruel to the Carthaginians. I mean, the point, I guess they had been fighting for 100 years. And so they wanted vengeance. They wanted to establish a precedent of strength. This was what would happen if you face us. But generally, when Rome would conquer a place, they were nowhere near this cruel. I mean, that's unsustainable, that level of cruelty. They would typically conquer and then absorb, make the people citizens. And that's really one of the things that sets Rome apart from so many of these other early empires. So I don't want to justify what they did, but it's not the standard, I guess. So yeah, what they did to Carthage was, man. Yeah. So there's to the story, but we'll move on. Now, the Roman state, like everywhere in the world pre-industrial revolution, was made up of farms. It's an agrarian state. But over time, they really found these small farms struggled to compete with a larger business interest. And I mean, that's the story of the world. But this was happening on such a large scale, so many farmers were being displaced or forced to sell their land cheaply or even in many cases, the land, they were declaring bankruptcy and their land was being absorbed by the state. That as a result of this, and honestly this happens every time there's a significant depression or recession in the United States or anywhere really, where when common people struggle and have to sell their property, it's purchased by wealthier folks who are often doing that as an investment. And this was happening in Rome, this is happening in the present world. And so what this does is it allows those with wealth to consolidate, to develop large estates, and most of these estates, most of these large farms were plantations, run by slaves. And so this decline of small business being replaced by huge enterprise, the Latin word for this is latifundious, and again, this is just that process of, man, if you're a John Steinbeck fan, he writes a lot about that, particularly in Grapes of Wrath. Now, this was becoming so bad, and when you have class struggle and it becomes worse and worse, I mean, the extreme cases are what happened in Russia in 1917, where the people just rise up and start killing the wealthy. The same thing happened in France in 1789. So to prevent this, and in fact, the United States took some drastic steps in the 1930s to prevent, such an extreme case of class unrest that could result in revolution. And so the leaders of Rome realized that when it gets so desperate that hardworking people can't make a living, can't eat, I mean, desperate people will turn to desperate measures. And so the leaders of Rome, particularly two named Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, came to believe that this wasn't just an economic problem. This was a large scale. This was the problem of the people. This was the problem of the state. And so they decided that they would declare emergency powers, act as the chief executives, and bypass the Senate entirely, and that they would allow the council of the plebes. So this is similar to the House of Representatives. So they would allow the House to pass these land reform bills that called on the government to reclaim and to redistribute land. So I don't want to make a direct comparison, but it is similar to the very ambitious infrastructure bills that are being passed in the House of Representatives and how they're getting shot down in the Senate, and how there's just this gridlock between the House and the Senate. And so what the two consuls, Tiberius and Gaius, did, which really, it is strange to think, but there were two presidents in Rome called consuls, and they shared power. And so they effectively bypassed the Senate and allowed the House to pass, or the Council of Plebes, to pass these significant reforms. The Senate didn't take this well. I mean, if you follow politics today, the Senate just sometimes will just block off things because they can, and they'll stop significant legislation like this. And if a president were to try to bypass the Senate, well, for one, they can't do that. If they tried, that would be an impeachable offense. If somehow they got away with it, that would be a constitutional crisis. And that's actually what's happening here, is that the consuls weren't allowed to do this. They were not allowed to bypass the Senate. But the Senate was in a bit of a pickle because the reforms that were being passed were very popular. So they couldn't appeal to the people and say they're not allowed to do this because the people loved these reforms. So instead they murdered them. Go figure. And Tiberius first, Gaius about 12 years later. This is not a good situation when you have a Senate conspiring to kill your chief executives. That's not healthy. And that's, of course, why this slide's called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Republic. That's the first warning sign. What this did was actually resulted in a civil war. The Roman general Marius recruited his armies in a new way. In fact, he recruited directly from this displaced people, from this new landless class that were having to sell off their land to very wealthy people because they could no longer make a living. And they're angry and they're jobless. And so what are they going to do? Well, this Roman general Gaius or Marius is offering them a place in the military. And this new voluntary army swore allegiance not to Rome, but directly to Marius. And so if you're ever following or reading World War II history and you start to read about the brown shirts in Germany or the black shirts in Italy, it's a very similar story, where you have a lot of civil unrest, you have a lot of instability, and then you have armies developing loyal to particular people, not necessarily the state. And so it's not a good sign. But they became a type of professional army, and really not too different than the brown shirts or the black shirts of World War II. So during the 1st century BCE, you have these 3 individuals that come to hold enormous political power: Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar. Though at the time he was just called Gaius Julius Quintus, I think. They all had multiple names, but one of them was Quintus, which means 5, because they did name, part of the name was how many of that name are they. So he was the 5th of his name. Anyway, of these, Crassus was the wealthiest man in all of Rome. And he had also proved to be a successful military commander, particularly against a major slave uprising. This is the story of Spartacus. So I'm just going to digress for a moment and tell you guys the story of Spartacus because it's amazing. There is a movie about this from the 1960s. I think Kurt Russell played the lead. What's that?
There's a show.
There is a modern show, and it is violent, and it is very gratuitous, and I don't know. I was like, wow, that's a bit much.
More
but
300-ish.
yeah, wow. They really went for shock value for the series. But the old movie is well done too. It's just not as modern. But he started out as a gladiator, and he was very good at what he did. And gladiators were kind of like professional athletes. I mean, they were famous. There were people, everyone in Rome knew about these people. And not every gladiatorial contest resulted in death. In fact, more commonly, they would fight to, one would submit. And it was more common, in fact, it was kind of taboo for gladiators to kill each other on purpose. It did happen, sometimes it happened on purpose, but it was less common than you might think. Anyway, Spartacus grew to prominence, and eventually he decided that he no longer liked his position as a slave, and so he convinced those at his school, at his gladiators trained in groups. So in his group, there were about 70 other gladiators and slaves, and so they rebelled. At the time, there were just 70, and they managed to escape the city of Rome. And they fled to a mountaintop, and the Roman army surrounded them because slave uprisings were feared. And Rome and any other civilization would expend considerable resources to try to put them down quickly. Because remember, the Helot uprising nearly destroyed Sparta. I mean, Sparta, the warrior race. So Rome was afraid of this, and rightly so. They surrounded the mountain, and Spartacus and this handful of fighters managed to start a panic in the camps at night, cause absolute chaos, and they routed a much larger force. And this grew inspiring. The slave uprising went from just 100 to a few hundred people to, by its height, roughly 100,000 slaves that had risen up. And this is Rome, while becoming politically unstable, still significantly powerful. And multiple legions were recalled from the frontiers to put down this uprising. And so, the end battle, Spartacus was captured and forced to fight one of his closest friends to the death. and then the survivor and all of the rest of the slaves were crucified on the road between Rome and Naples. So I tell you that story to introduce Crassus. He was leading the suppression of that revolt. And even though today I root for the slaves every time, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is one of the most significant slave uprisings in history, and not all of them have failed. The country of Haiti is an independent country, was formerly a French slave colony. So was Jamaica. So were many places where slaves rose up and took matters into their own hands. And so Crassus put down this uprising. But in Rome, he was very famous for this, very influential and very wealthy. Meanwhile, the next person is Pompey, also a successful military commander, particularly in the Roman conquest of Spain. And so he was hailed as a hero. And then Julius Caesar, the one I'm sure you all know, who has an amazing life story. So I'd recommend a series of books if you're interested in Julius Caesar by Con Iggulden. He writes historical fiction. It's very well done. And it follows Caesar from his young life as the son of a senator through this civil war that we're about to talk about, all the way until he became emperor, and we'll see what happens in just a moment. So these three became the first triumvirate, and we've already had some traditions and precedents completely shattered. They are effectively three consuls, where there should have been two. But they joined together to form this triumvirate, or this alliance. And each of these men had a military command. The idea was that they would divide the empire into three parts to consolidate, to more effectively administer this growing empire. So Pompey in Spain, Crassus in Syria, or the Middle East entirely, and then Caesar in Gaul, what is today France. In fact, most of his military career was spent in Gaul and Germania fighting, and even before he went back to Rome, was primarily successful and responsible for conquering Great Britain. And so the reason the Romans got to Great Britain, and Julius Caesar is right up there with Alexander the Great in terms of some of the world's greatest conquerors. So each of these have a military command. Crassus was later killed in battle, and so instead of having this shared power, now there's this major vacuum. The Middle East is up for grabs. And this is going to result in a major conflict between Caesar and now Pompey, because a third of the Roman Empire was left leaderless. And the two are going to start yet another civil war. And for the next several years, Julius Caesar and Pompey fought various parts of all over the world. Julius Caesar became great friends with Cleopatra, was then the Pharaoh of Egypt, and in really his campaigns to conquer and absorb the Middle East, because this had once been Crassus's role, and now Julius Caesar was going after this. Now, Caesar would go on to win this conflict and become dictator for life of a new unified Rome. And he increased the Senate to 900 members. He now has full executive power, though the Senate existed, but almost in the sense that if you're a Star Wars fan, there was the Emperor and then there was the Senate. In fact, Star Wars closely follows the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. So there's a Senate, there's 900 members. They do the work of effectively passing policies that then Caesar carries out, except they only pass policies that he agreed with. So maybe they're more symbolic than functional. But he went on to commit to a number of major reforms. And while he's a dictator, not necessarily up for election, the Senate can't actually disagree with him. but he made a number of reforms that were incredibly popular. For one, we have a calendar now based around the Earth's revolution of the sun, 365 days per year. Named dictator for life in 47 BCE. He made a number of, I guess some of the most important of his reforms were fixing the problem of the latifundis, of all of these displaced farmers. He actually redistributed the land in a fair way. So what the Council of Plebes had been trying to do, and what Tiberius and Gaius had been trying to push through, Julius Caesar finally did it. And he instituted these reforms that greatly benefited the poor. So he was so incredibly popular, he had rendered the legislature obsolete. And what does the Senate do when someone tries to go over their heads? Well, I'm sure you all know that Julius Caesar was murdered, well, stabbed to death repeatedly in the Senate by the senators. And the conspiracy they had agreed to was they called him there to discuss some legislation. And then every single one of them stabbed him so that they would all be complicit. And if you believe William Shakespeare, who wrote the play Julius Caesar, Caesar's best friend, who was then a senator named Brutus, stabbed Caesar last in the chest, looked him straight in the eyes, and then Caesar's last words, at least according to Shakespeare, were "Et tu, Brute," or "You too, Brutus," his best friend. But the Senate wanted to send a powerful message that for anyone who attempts to overthrow the republic, no matter how popular they may be, has committed a great act of treason against the republic itself. Well, the trouble with dictators is killing them doesn't fix everything. It doesn't just magically, yay, we're all happy and peaceful again. No, unfortunately, it's quite the opposite. So for example, we'll get to this later, but if you hop over to Mexico's history, when they declared independence from Spain, and then it was shortly after followed by a series of revolutions, violent uprising, replaced by dictator. So just if memory serves, you have the cruel general Victoriano Huerta, replaced by Francisco Madero, later replaced by the first elected president, I can't remember his first name, but Carranza. And so eventually Mexico did become more stable. But the point is, when you have powerful leaders getting assassinated, it's not a good sign. And so Rome's not going back to a republic. In fact, Caesar's assassination caused another civil war. And so now you have multiple civil wars within a generation. Again, typically this leads to an entire collapse of a state. And so in this case, the civil war is between Mark Antony, one of the prominent leaders in the Senate who conspired to kill, and Octavian. His name literally means eighth of his name. He would change his name to Augustus, Latin for exalted one. He was the grandnephew of Julius Caesar, and at the Battle of Actium, he would defeat all of his rivals and become the emperor of Rome. Now, while they kept troops there, and so really that's imperial rule at its best, is you have. Now, Augustus was succeeded by his stepson, Tiberius. And by his actions, Augustus had established a dynasty. It's called the Julio-Claudian dynasty. And the next 4 emperors were all part of this dynasty, related to this family, or that of Augustus's wife, Livia. Now, however, more of the responsibilities that Augustus had given to the Senate were taken up by the emperors. So, for example, again, back to Star Wars, eventually the Senate was just dissolved. And eventually the Senate here, while allowed to continue to function in name, just became completely obsolete, a ceremonial title at best. And so this opens up the potential for corruption. You know, the old phrase, absolute power corrupts. And really, you know, this amount of power centralized in one family, in one branch of a government, even though it's called the Pax Romana, even though the first 5 emperors were called the 5 good emperors, the prosperity that's created and that we think about when we think of Rome is primarily benefiting a select few. And so the chief benefits of Roman rule during the 1st and 2nd centuries were especially notable, though, during the reign of these 5 emperors, or these 5 good emperors. So a few things that make them good emperors, despite the potential for corruption, is the Roman practice of tolerance. When they would conquer an area, they had no interest in changing the culture or forcing the people to believe a certain way. They could practice their religion, they could live their life, they could become Roman citizens. And this is just a real strength of diplomacy, is that being absorbed by the Roman Empire was seen by so many people as a good thing. You know, some places were inviting Rome to annex them. Now, these men were so capable at governing their empire because they also chose capable people as their successors and capable people to rule on their behalf. Now, part of the reason for the eventual decline of the Roman Empire is going to be the problem of succession. With so much power centralized into one person, it becomes crucial that that person be a good leader. I mean, if they're a good leader, then at least, while it's not democracy, at least things can be run smoothly. But it's not going to always be the case. So under these good emperors, scope of imperial administration was expanded. This gave administration to areas previously untouched by the government. That means that places like far Britannia, today Great Britain, are going to get aqueducts, are going to get forums, are going to get these massive infrastructure programs, because Rome is not only expanding its military influence, it's beginning to expand its infrastructure and its administrative influence. So there's a word in Old English called "inte ye work," and it means the work of giants. And so when the Anglo-Saxons dominated Great Britain and had conquered most of England, when they began going into these cities like London, then spelled Lunden, they saw the works of the Romans and these huge structures that the Romans had built, and these roads that just were beyond their capacity to build, these aqueducts that were stories tall. The use of concrete, which was a Roman concept and new to the world. They thought it was an advanced civilization, and for many people, it was for the time. If for nothing else, their technology. So these bridges, these roads throughout the province and throughout Rome itself. Now, the real story, even though this was a very advanced civilization for its time, they were prone to corruption. And not everyone was just all hunky-dory and happy under Roman rule. So while it could sound like, hey, Rome's this great ideal, in reality, there were constant rebellions. For one, in Syria, so kind of the sequel to the Gospels is that another person claimed to be the Messiah, and he's known as Joseph of Maccabees, and it's called the Maccabees Rebellion. And he claimed to be a Messiah not in a spiritual way, but many of the Jews had interpreted the prophets to say that this Messiah would free them from Roman occupation and would create or recreate the new independent state of Israel and rebuild the Jewish nation. And so the Maccabees promised to be that Messiah, and the Roman Emperor Tacitus did what they had done to Carthage to Judea. So if you've ever wondered why the Jews were the largest displaced group of people until 1948, it's because they rebelled against the Romans. And while, for the most part, when the Romans would conquer a place, they would be tolerant. But when a place would rebel, they were cruel. And so when the Jews rebelled, the Roman emperor destroyed their cities, you know, completely killed everyone who resisted them, and then told the Jews they had to leave, that they could no longer reside in Judea. And this began a period called the diaspora. They began wandering and settled throughout Russia, throughout Europe, throughout the Middle East, in North Africa. Of course, millions of Jews would move to the United States throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and they just became a displaced people as a result of a rebellion against Rome. There's another case in the year 61 that a British tribal queen named Boadicea led an attack on the Roman rule before the Romans eventually won out. Now, eventually, by the time we get to Hadrian and then later Diocletian, the Romans are going to withdraw from many of these frontier provinces like Great Britain. But these earlier emperors really expanded the empire's territory. But the problem with Rome, and the irony here is if you look at the Roman Empire at its height and you squish it all together, it's roughly the size of the United States with an equivalent population. And the Romans found that it was too big to rule. Now, with our technology and capacity, you know, we still manage to be divided, don't we? It's still a really big country. People in Alaska still think very differently than people in Florida. And there are these kind of differing views of government in so many different parts of the country. So anyway, later emperors recognized the difficulty of maintaining and defending these borders and eventually withdrew from some of these provinces, leaving them alone entirely. So including Mesopotamia. So the Romans had actually conquered Babylon and then decided it wasn't worth it and left. Now, around the 2nd century of the Common Era, the Roman Empire was one of the greatest and most powerful states the world had ever seen, but actually had an equivalent population to the Han Dynasty in China. So, in a Western Civ course, you might hear just the story of Rome, but this is a World Civ course, so I also want to spend some time at the end. Well, we're almost out of time, but the video will cover a little bit more of the Han Dynasty in China. So, China has roughly 50 million people. So a rough equivalent population to the entire Roman Empire. So these later emperors provided a degree of unity while giving this great degree of tolerance, this leeway to local custom, extending citizenship to people throughout the empire. And so by the year 212, every free inhabitant of the empire could be a Roman citizen. Latin was the main language, but Greek was also spoken. Many languages and cultures were spoken throughout the Roman Empire. So this is really a time of prosperity, relative internal peace, unprecedented levels of foreign trade. In fact, even though the Han Dynasty is roughly equivalent in power and wealth and population, they actually did a great deal of business with the Roman Empire. The Silk Road is just an informal trade route connecting China to Rome. It's an overland trade route. It's not, an interstate highway by any means, but it's a popular enough trade route that there were towns and cities along the way, and travel was relatively safe and very prosperous, bringing goods overland all the way from China to Rome. Of course, the main basis for the economy is still agriculture. This is still an agrarian world. Most people are still farmers. Most people still live on small farms, or we're renting farms from these large, wealthy estates. The gulf between the rich and the poor didn't get fixed. Caesar perhaps made some reforms, but there was still a massive gulf between the rich and the poor. And the rich grew richer. So, just looking at trade briefly, the point of this map is you can just see goods were going in and out and all over. So we're running close on time here, so I'll be brief with the rest of it. A few points about Roman literature. They wrote a sequel to the Iliad, connecting the Greek story to the Roman story. So you can read more about that on your own. I think Rome's greatest contribution in the arts are their architecture and construction projects, particularly concrete, maybe one of the most significant inventions out of the entire empire. Though Roman law might rival concrete because it served as the basis for a republican style of government. So while we adopted much of our style from English common law, they adopted much of their style from Justinian's code, which is really just the 12 tables or Roman law. So what was family like? Pater familias is just a way of saying that they are a patriarchal society. The oldest male in each family was the leader, the chief. Marriages were arranged. Some provided education for their daughters, though there was no public system. It was more private tutors for those who could afford it. But this was no longer the dominant culture by the 2nd century of the Common Era. Upper class women had much more freedom. I just thought this was neat. This is a fresco, a painting that was actually preserved in Pompeii. So Pompeii is a city in Italy during the Roman Empire that was destroyed by a volcano. And so much of Rome has changed in the Roman city, and it's still, a very populous city, and so it's hard to see Rome as it once was. But Pompeii is different. It was buried in ash and discovered, in the modern era. And so we can see from Pompeii what life was like. Okay. As I said, slavery was common. There were household slaves. There were slaves in the fields. There were slaves in the arenas. There were slaves working in construction. It was a society built on slavery. So we already talked about Spartacus a little bit, so we'll move on. The Colosseum is an important symbol of the Roman Empire. In fact, if you're a Hunger Games fan, it's also based on the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. And one of the reasons, if you've read all the way to the 3rd book, one of the reasons why the Hunger Games existed is based on an old Roman concept that they called bread and circus. Is that if you provide people with their basic needs, food, shelter, and if you provide them with entertainment, you'd be surprised how much freedom they'd be willing to give up if their basic needs are met and if they're entertained. So, Colosseum serves a very important role in maintaining peace and stability because, well, who didn't watch the Super Bowl? It's awesome, right? I missed it, but it's still awesome. I'm going to go back and watch at least the halftime show. Because why? Well, it's a sporting event. It's cool. It might not all be everyone's thing, but it's something everybody knows is going on. It's a shared national experience. And that's what the gladiators served as. They were the Tom Brady. They were the superstars of their day. Now, that was the Pax Romana. That was the height, the glory of the Roman Empire. But things began to quickly decline and go downhill from there. And I'll just summarize since we're almost out of time. Economic problems were one of the key reasons for the fall of the Roman Empire. Poor leadership, which some have theorized could have been caused by either excessive inbreeding, even lead pipes. Too much lead exposure can make you go mad, and the Romans, with all their sophistication, were using lead pipes for their indoor plumbing. So Anyway, other problems, the military was just under increasing strain to keep off foreign invaders and even to maintain peace and stability. So the military kind of served as the police and defense, and they were just becoming increasingly strained. And Rome was struggling economically, leading to massive amounts of debt and inflation, and so Rome was really just struggling. It's not to say there were no good leaders beyond that point. Diocletian and Constantine are significant in trying to make some reforms to preserve the Western Empire. Most notably, Constantine recognized Christianity as a new, not official religion until a couple emperors later. Theodosius would later adopt Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. They also made significant military reforms, expanding the military, expanding civil service, and then also moving a significant amount of their political power over to Constantinople, which would prove to be a better place. Rome was on the decline. Constantinople was on the rise. So I'm going to end there, because eventually the empire was divided into two parts, which became two independent states. The empire in the west was beset by constant invasion of Germanic tribes, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Huns. Here you're seeing a trailer for Attila the Hun, and he was the most powerful chieftain of the Huns. He was a predecessor of Genghis Khan, who used terrorist tactics to conquer both the empire's Germanic neighbors, and eventually he became famous for conquering Rome itself. And so as we look at invasions that beset the Roman Empire, you see that by 350 the empire was split into two parts. You have the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire. And by 500 AD, the Western Empire was no more. The Middle Ages were beginning. These places were splitting off into city-states and feudal towns and principalities, and there was not much central government left. However, the Eastern Empire endured, and we'll be talking more about it next week. In fact, the Byzantine Empire endured until the 1100s AD. Now, the Western Roman Empire came to an end. The last person to conquer the empire, I say last because there were many, Attila the Hun, various Germanic chieftains, but the last was a man named Odoacer, and he was Germanic. The last emperor of the Roman Empire's name was Romulus, and he was deposed by this Odoacer, who entered the city and declared himself the new emperor of Rome. And by that time, we say the Roman Empire was done for. But now let's talk about religion in the Roman Empire. Because traditionally, Romans were polytheistic, meaning they believed in many different gods. The emperors like to declare themselves gods. Augustus means exalted one. He wanted to be worshipped. Romans were generally tolerant of other religions. They did require that once you submit to the empire, you declare that the emperor is God, and then otherwise you were left to your own devices. The Romans had frequent contact with the Jews. As perhaps you know, the Romans conquered Judea, and it remained a Roman province until AD 70, when Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed, and the Jews were dispersed, told to leave their homeland. as I said, typically the Romans were polytheistic. Now what we're looking at here is a detail of horsemen warriors, and this was carved into concrete on a column, showing the Roman Emperor Antonius Pius. But as perhaps you also know, Jesus of Nazareth became the founder of Christianity. He was born a Jew. He based many of his teachings on monotheism. Of course, the Jewish religion is based on the idea of one God. In the 300s BCE, during the Babylonian captivity, the Jewish people wrote down their stories. And among these were the writing of the Ten Commandments, where God gave the law to the Jewish people. And Jesus' message tied in the idea of Judaism with his preachings. Now, most of the information that we have about Jesus' life comes from the first 4 books of the New Testament. These are called the Gospels. Of course, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And some of Jesus' followers went on to do amazing things. Some of the more famous are Peter, who would become the first pope of the Catholic Church. Even in the Gospels, it talks about how it establishes a precedent for Peter going on to lead this new church. Well, Jesus was seen as a revolutionary because he taught that there was a higher law than the Roman law. He also taught that there was more to religion than what the Jewish establishment had been preaching. He made many enemies throughout his ministry. And eventually the Jewish people brought him before the leader of the Roman province of Judea. His name was Pontius Pilate. And they demanded that this man be crucified for crimes against their religion and crimes against Rome. Now, Jesus' followers believed that after he was crucified, he was resurrected, meaning that he was raised from the dead. And because of this belief, he's been called the Messiah, or the Christos, meaning the Anointed One. His message was spread by his disciples, as well as a man named Paul of Tarsus. And so Paul traveled throughout the Greek city-states, throughout the Western Roman Empire, and began to spread this message, which was being called Christianity. So here's Paul. You can see this is definitely Western European middle-aged painting, because the message of Christianity particularly took and spread in that part of the world. Now, the spread of Christianity. Followers of Christianity spread this message all throughout the Roman world. There were some works of writing. The earliest Christian writings date back to within 50 years of Jesus' death. So unfortunately, we don't have any writings that date back to when Jesus was alive, but there are some within a generation or two of his death. The first book written after Jesus' death was the Gospel of Mark, and then I believe Matthew, and then Luke, and then John was about 90 years after his death. But these written materials of the Gospels, the first 4 books, and then the epistles, which were letters mainly written by Paul to the Christian churches, became part of what is today the New Testament. Now, for quite some time, the Romans simply ignored the Christians. They were tolerant of other religions, as long as people acknowledged the emperor as supreme and as God. But Christianity had some teachings which conflicted with Roman culture. For one, there was a promise of salvation. that there was an afterlife that Christians could look forward to. People clung to Jesus' message. For example, his preachings of the poor inheriting the earth, of humility as a virtue, of meekness as strength. Eventually, the church became organized. Now, the first several popes were martyred or killed, typically by the Romans. But as the church became more organized, over time it was even recognized by the Roman government. Constantine became the first Christian emperor. And by the reign of Theodosius, it became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so here you can see the spread of Christianity. You know, here's Judea, here's the city of Jerusalem. You can see limited spread within 300 years. And by 500 years, you see that most of the former Roman Empire had been exposed to Christianity, but you also see the boundary of the Western Roman Empire. And so now we're going to transition with the time we have left into talking about the Han empires in China. Because as Rome was growing and developing, so was the Han Empire in China. And the two engaged in quite a bit of business together. The founder of this dynasty was Han Cao-Su. The official ideology was Confucianism. The Confucian doctrine eventually integrated with the legalistic institutions. You may remember legalism, the strict adherence to law and order. The Chinese government was unique and famous for promotion on the basis of merit as opposed to birth, using examinations to prove your competency, and even establishing schools to train officials. China is also known for having a rapidly growing population. Now, the Chinese economy during this time was a time of unparalleled productivity and prosperity. Domestic and foreign trade expanded. The most popular trade avenue was the Silk Road. The state was in control of manufacturing, weapons production, shipyards, granaries, and mines. So the government owned the means of production. But even during this time, there were a number of technological innovations, such as textile manufacturing, water mills, the casting of iron, the production of steel, of paper, the rudder used in boats, and so navigation by sea became more efficient as a result of technology. But now, the reason I bring up China, as well, yes, it's in your book, but also that as the Han dynasty continued to expand into Vietnam, as far west as the Caspian Sea, as far north into Central Asia, there was extensive commerce between China and Rome. China needed horses for its military. Western Europe has an abundance of horses. And the Romans needed silk. The Chinese at this time were still the only people who knew how to make silk. Now, the bulk of the trade, as I said, was overland. We're not yet at the point where ships had the technology to navigate around the tip of Africa. We were not yet at the point where there were canals dug connecting the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. And so trade between China and Rome is going to have to occur over land. That's a long ways to travel by camel. Also, during the time of the Han Dynasty, social institutions became more complex. The nuclear family, meaning the importance of fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, became even more so important. Most Chinese people still lived in rural areas, cities still located along rivers. However, we begin to see a network of trade routes increasing. More roads, more flow of commerce. Now, the imperial capital of the Han Dynasty was Chang. The religion focused on the reverence to local deities and spirits, though during the Han Dynasty, Buddhism was introduced. Some of the first Chinese historians, meaning objective writers, not just glorifying their leaders, appeared during this time. There's also examples in your book of Chinese painting, and the use of iron instead of bronze became prevalent at this time. And so this would be what we call China's Iron Age.